Wie geht's? Kultur in Zeiten des Coronavirus. Welcome to another international episode of Wie geht's, a podcast of conversations with people working in the arts, culture policy and the creative industries, reflecting on how the COVID-19 crisis affects the cultural sphere. My name is Martin Zierold, Director of the Institute for Arts and Media Management at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Hamburg, Germany, which is producing this podcast. The title of this podcast in German, Wie geht's, has a double meaning. It translates as, how are you? We want to know how people in the arts are doing during these extraordinary and challenging times. Yet, Wie geht's also means, how does it work? On this podcast, we hope to share fresh ideas, learnings, stories, experiments on how we learn to rethink our practices and our role for societies as we try to come to grips with this crisis. Today, we take a look at the UK and two specific artistic fields, photography and theatre. My guest in this episode is Joanna Vestey, a photographer who recently launched the project Custodians for COVID, focused on raising money for theatres currently in crisis due to the COVID-imposed lockdown. Her project includes world-renowned theatres such as the National Theatre, Shakespeare's Globe, the Royal Court Theatre and the Young Vic. I strongly encourage listeners not familiar with that work to take a look at this podcast website, covid-culture.com, to take a look at some examples of the project and the stunning photographs in order to get a better idea of the project we will be talking about. Beyond that, we will also reflect on the situation of theatres and the arts more broadly in the UK at this point in time. My guest today, Joanna Vestey, is an award-winning photographer based in Oxford, who is making images that explore the presentation and digitization of knowledge. She studied photography at the Surrey Institute of Art and Design and at Bezalel Academy in Jerusalem. She completed a practice-led PhD at the European Centre for Photographic Research, and her work has been widely commissioned, published and exhibited both in the UK and abroad, and is held by several collections, including 5 images acquired by the National Portrait Gallery in London. Her recent series, Custodians, was published as a book in 2015. I'm connected via Zoom with Joanna Vestey, a photographer based in the United Kingdom, with a great project on the situation of theatres in Britain, in London. We're going to talk about that. But the first question in this podcast is always a very general one. Joanna, how are you?
Lovely to join you. I'm good. In fact, I feel very blessed. I've been at home with my children for 4 months now. I've got 2 teenagers. And I've really had time to think in new ways and recalibrate a little bit, sort of think creatively and, just pursue a few things which have been slightly on my to-do list for some time. So, I'm good. Thank you.
That sounds like you're really making the best out of this extraordinary situation. We'll be talking about your work as an artist, which is interesting in itself, and also is interesting because you're dealing with artistic organizations, dealing with theaters. But before we go there, as most of our listeners will be in Germany, and maybe not everybody's following the situation in the UK, the idea we get in Germany is that in terms of the health situation, things have been bad, but have gotten much better. How do you experience daily life right now? But most importantly, for our context, what's the situation for the arts like in the UK, if it can be generalized at all?
Yes, there's lots of different issues in there. I think day-to-day life, actually, things have carried on. Obviously, some people have been impacted much harder than others, but generally, all the supply chains worked, the hospitals weren't overwhelmed. People have had access to what they need. So I think that kind of the day-to-day base level has been good. And I think now, obviously people are coming out of lockdown and trying to find their feet. The arts, as you kind of point out, absolutely have been hit hardest. And I think very much have been kind of further down the list of areas for the government to get to and try and understand how to help them. And I think there's so many different issues tied in with that, from the kind of big museums and gallery spaces through to the very small independents and the freelancers and the artisans that make up all of those different creative industries. And trying to find a sort of one size fits all is always going to be impossible. So I think just at the moment, people are trying to feel their way around as to how their sort of new futures might look within that horizon.
If we turn to your project Custodians for COVID, that's a project designed to support theaters. If you just tell us the basic idea first, where did it come from, and how's the core idea working?
So a few years ago, I did a project in Oxford, which was called Custodians, and it was an individual position within a space, within a lecture space or a museum. And I'd said to each institution, would they select the custodian? I was really interested in how, with a photograph, you can touch on many different times, and you could read into it the kind of earliest moment of the building or the more transient position of the human, and kind of the sense of scale, almost referencing sort of Piranesi and kind of classical painters and drawers who had used that human figure to give a sense of perspective. And when COVID happened, I was sort of thinking about, how to help in some way, how arts can support other arts, and whether there was something that we could do. I noticed that Le Monde had started posting some of my original Custodians pictures on Instagram with hashtag self-isolation. And actually it made me kind of think, gosh, actually, these are really relevant. And there is something to be said about the individual within these spaces, and just questioning kind of the situation. And the more I was reading about theatres, the media were actually talking a lot about theatres at the time here. Just sort of thinking, actually, this is really poignant, and this is a way that I could get involved and actually support another medium. So yeah, I just sort of started ringing around theatres and trying to secure access to them.
And how difficult was that organizational part to start with? Because I imagine that it's not necessarily easy to get access and to be able to really produce a photograph that's aesthetically on the level that you're working on.
I think what was really clear really quick was how many people had been furloughed, and these places had literally been mothballed. The majority of them, nobody had stepped into them. Some of them, someone went in literally and sort of ran the water, flushed the loos, turned the lights on. But other ones had even powered off half the lights. So I think it was a question of kind of being able to reach out and actually kind of connect with someone, and then trying to just logistically do it. We shot it just towards the end of lockdown, where you were just allowed to start making day trips for work and adhere to social distancing and things. So we were able to get access. There were a few places we couldn't because there was literally nobody going in, and the lights went on. So,
and I encourage everyone listening to the podcast to take a look at the photos, because I guess that gives the best idea. And we put a link on the podcast websites so that people can easily access them. In terms of the artistic perspective, I imagine it must be very hard to in a way document an absence, try to capture that specific moment when the buildings are empty, other than the one custodian that's always on the picture. How did you go about planning that as an artist? What was important to you in working on this project aesthetically?
I'm always reminded by something that Paul Valery said, the poet, and he wrote about the active presence of absent things. And to me, that's very much when you start to see the series together and you just see empty space after empty space after empty space. There's something so poignant about that absence. And in a way, without the custodial figure in it, it just becomes an empty room. But the minute you've got a person in there, there's a tension between the two.
Yeah, I really love the images, and I think they're like you said, they really grasp that moment. And a question I always had looking at them myself was, how much do I, as a viewer, bring in? How important is it that I know that context? And I think at the same time they have something in their own right, even if you would take them out of that specific context. That figure of the custodian. As you said, it's not the first time you're working with that idea. Was it always obvious who that person would be? And was it hard for them to relate to that role in the picture? Because it's not a portrait. It's really they're usually someplace, sometimes you even have to look for them to find them. How was that working with the specific people producing these kind of mini portraits in those huge spaces?
Yeah, I think a lot of the people kind of when you reach out to them, they Google you and they have a little look and see what you've done before. So I think some of them knew the sort of style that I worked in. And then there were a couple who turned up and, had obviously got made up and were a little bit like, you really trying to hide me in the back, and almost felt a little bit kind of like something was wrong, or rather than actually realizing that's exactly how I like to work, is just having a sort of hint of someone rather than, as you say, it's more of a kind of environmental portrait, I guess, rather than a kind of personal portrait. But I've always been led very much by the institutions or the spaces I photographed, and it sort of said to them, would they provide who they feel is the most kind of, I guess for them, that is the most meaningful custodian, or someone they feel has got a deep relationship with the space. So in some of these, we had someone who'd open the door every day for 30 years, someone else who'd worked there for 25 years. There tends to be someone who's got a really sort of long relationship. But really broad. I mean, literally everybody from directors to catering to security staff, and that's what I think is really special when you invite people to make their own choices, who's provided. And then again, I don't do any styling or anything. So, and rarely do people say, what should I wear? How should I look? They just turn up. And there's something rather lovely about kind of working in a way, you have to think, kind of work quite quickly, walk into space you've never been into, working with someone, and very much what you've got on the day. There's a touch of sort of reportage about it, even though they look much more staged than that.
Yeah, I also found that the images look really thought through. How much time did you have to work in that space, and what kind of equipment did you use to get that really? It does. They don't look like a snapshot at all. They look like something with a long run up and long planning. But you, as you said, you more or less showed up and probably had half a day, I guess. How did that work technically?
Half a day would have been a treat. There was some where we shot 5 in about 5 hours, and that included driving around London as well. So literally, I mean, a couple of them we were down to sort of 30 minutes.
Wow.
But, you can see a lot online. I do a lot of work, a lot of research online. So I've got an idea of an interior and how it looks. And you never know, again, when you get there, the lighting's different, or actually there's a set in the middle of it, which you hadn't thought there was going to be. So all those sort of elements are definitely sort of surprise elements. But actually, I tend to find when you work with people, you get an image quite quickly. There's something really magical about that initial interaction that you have with someone. And then actually, I didn't really want to stand photographing them for half an hour, because we've sort of had that lovely moment and they've given something and I've recorded it, and then we're sort of done. So it's a really nice way of working. But actually, I make a decision. I'm very decisive. I kind of decide where the tripod's going and then work from there, rather than sort of, I know a lot of people shoot 10 different pictures and then they'll go home and edit and think about it. But it's a very kind of clear way of working.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No. That's good.
Yeah. One project that's going on in Germany in a combination, a network of museums is trying to already start collecting documents for future archives of this current contemporary moment. And I think those images of theaters obviously would be perfect material for that. Again, more generally as a photographer, do you think we take enough time to, in a way, preserve that moment? And have you seen other work that you find aesthetically inspiring, dealing with this COVID situation, also in light of future generations and really cultural heritage and memory of the special time?
Yeah, I've seen a few. I think photography is really interesting right now, the way that everybody is now a photographer, and 85% of all images taken are now made on iPhones and cell phones. So we're just sort of bombarded by this incredible deluge of imagery. So I think in a way it's harder for photographers to make work that really stands out. But I've been really impressed. I think photography is really interesting how it's been used. Certainly here, there's been a couple of big print sales fundraising for the Trussell Trust and Artist Support Pledge, and people have been kind of using the medium to support others. And then I guess some standout work. Antoine Dagatar is a Magnum photographer, and he's been using a thermal imaging process and walking the streets of Paris. And the pictures are so poignant, and they just connect in a really it's a very subtle but very clever way of documenting what's been going on there. There's a Vogue fashion shoot here, Jamie Hawksmore, who shot all the frontline workers from post-delivery people, nurses, teachers, and they were all featured in Vogue, and they actually did separate covers for each of them as well. And again, it's just, he shoots on analog, processes it all himself, and they were just these beautiful pictures. So I think there have been kind of standout pieces, but it's funny because, I mean, most things when there's a crisis or when something happens, photographers roam the streets, but suddenly everybody was under lockdown. So there was a sort of different way of thinking about how to make work.
Yeah, I'd also be interested in the economical situation. In Germany, actually, it would be quite exceptional that individual artists do work trying to support big organizations like theaters, because in Germany the theaters are quite well funded even in the crisis, and so the trouble is much more with the individual artists right now. How is the situation working on both levels in the UK? On the one hand, you are an individual artist. At the same time, your work, you're not being paid for the work you're doing with the Custodians project, but actually you're contributing to the theaters. So are both sides suffering the same, or is there a difference in terms of economic impact of that crisis?
Yeah, here our theatres aren't government supported. In the same way as they are in Germany. So it's very much sort of individual arts organizations. So yeah, no, I agree. I think in a way, I think creatives just make work when they can. And it's that creative spirit which just keeps you moving forward. And a project like this, it wasn't so much whether I was going to get paid for it or not, but it was just an opportunity to keep making work, which I really believed in and really felt passionate about. And I'm a big believer in a sort of karma of a favor bank. And, you build up these projects and then suddenly someone invites you to do something else or collaborate on another project. So it's been a real opportunity to kind of support a wider group. And obviously keep doing some work that I feel really passionately about.
Looking towards the future, how do you expect the situation to develop? I mean, obviously nobody can really tell, but in terms of especially the situation for the arts, are you more optimistic that there'll be good learnings we can take from this, or are you more skeptical and the fear that also the economical situation will be very bad in the future and the situation for the arts will continue to be a crisis for a long time? How is that in the UK in your view?
I think it's going to be a long journey. I think, the situation from the arts on different levels is complicated. I think if you look at schools and university level, there's art being cut from the curriculum in favor of STEM subjects. So even from the very beginnings of it, I think it's become harder and harder for freelancers or for young people to sort of find their way in. And then when they become freelancers, to find their way out. So I think what's happened now is just compounded an awful lot of issues that were already beginning to surface. And really, it's just a question of how quickly the government can respond. I mean, we were in theatres who were saying that they wouldn't be able to start thinking about programming until September 2021. And within that, it's not just the sort of immediate theatres, but the set designers, the costume designers, the lighting tech, the graduates from the MA shows who are going to be directors, the whole spectrum of people involved will be impacted by those decisions. So, it'll just take time.
If somebody wants to support, the project is still ongoing and it's still possible to buy some of the photos you did for the Custodian project, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We said we'd sell for 8 weeks. So we've got another 5 weeks to go. They're all available on my website. And if you choose one theatre, the money from that one goes directly to that theatre.
And how's the project doing at this point? Where are you in your plan? I think you want to raise £1 million, right?
Yeah, we are just touching about 100,000 at the moment. And we've been overwhelmed with people's generosity and overwhelmed with envelopes and dispatch as well, actually. But yeah, no, I think we're on track. We're having some really interesting conversations with some of the auction houses and just beginning to reach out to partner with people about how we can spread the word. But yeah, we have been really, really overwhelmed by people's generosity and support of it.
Yeah, I can only really, really stress that, and also encourage people in Germany to take a look and maybe buy a picture. I've got a very special personal relation to some of the theaters because I stayed in London after my A-levels for a while and worked in some of these theaters. So that's why I already bought my 3 editions. And I really, wish you all the best for that project. The final question that we always ask in this podcast is a personal question again. In this time, which is scary on the one hand, unknown on the other hand, where do you find time to find inspiration, to look beyond the current moment? Is there something you can share with us that for you is an inspiring practice these days?
Yeah. Normally I spend so much of my time planning the future and planning next projects and planning what we'll do and what we'll do with the kids and how things are going to. I've just had to kind of rein all of that back and be very focused on the present moment and just sort of, you can't plan. I couldn't plan next week. You don't know what's going to happen next week. I couldn't plan a holiday. So actually just sort of even planning whether the kids will go back to school or not. None of that's totally certain right now. So actually I feel like that's been incredibly rewarding without even really trying to focus on the present moment. I've just sort of found myself in it, which has been great. And also, I've done a lot of exercise. I run, I swim, whenever I can. I'm a big wild swimmer. I'll go and swim in a river or in a lake. Whenever I can get out, I'll get out. And that, for me, has been really grounding, just to be able to kind of offset creativity, domestic life, and then actually being, outside and moving.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That's been a great conversation. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Martin.
This was the 51st edition of our podcast, Wie geht's? The cultural sphere during the coronavirus crisis. We already have a number of English editions and will continue to produce more. All existing and future episodes can be easily accessed through our website, covid-culture.com, where you will also find links and further notes to this episode. Next week, I will be talking to Maja Storch, one of the developers of the Zurich resource model, one of the most influential coaching and consulting approaches to support learning and development in organizations as well as individuals. Together, we will discuss how arts organizations can stay alive and develop in times of crises. However, the conversation with Maja Storch will be in German again, I'm afraid. I'm looking forward to our next editions. Take care. Bis bald. Passen Sie gut auf sich auf.